In the Belgian Grand Prix, Max Verstappen drove from P6 all the way up to leading the race after only 14 laps, which isn't particularly surprising to me. He finished 32 seconds ahead of Charles Leclerc in P3, but what if I told you that the Red Bulls were deliberately losing lap time during the race? The first and only question I've got is why? And then I realized the race engineers actually gave us some hints about this, and it all makes sense if you use your head. So are they sandbagging, or is something else going on? So let's rewind for a minute and I'll show you how I stumbled across all of this. I was doing my usual race weekend analysis report. I look at qualifying, I look at the race, I look at pace and degradation, I'll look at some telemetry and everything else, and I publish all that, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But here are the lap times for the entire race, and they're fuel corrected for Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc, and Hamilton. If you're wondering what fuel corrected means, it means I basically take the amount of fuel in the car, I guess how much they're burning per lap, which is actually pretty straightforward. I know how much fuel affects the lap time. I remove that so we can compare a stint on a soft at the beginning of the race, for example, and a stint on a soft at the end of the race, roughly. Here's stint 1, here's stint 2, here's where the track started to get wet and the driver started to lose quite a bit of lap time, and here's stint 3. Other things of note, here's Verstappen's fastest lap at the start of his third stint on the soft, and then here at the bottom right is Lewis's insane blistering lap on the medium, when he boxed for new mediums at the end of the race. He didn't have a new soft to fit. But the thing that caught my attention the most is Verstappen has a fair pace advantage in most of these stints, but look how fast and consistent this final stint is. So I decided to pull the laps together, and I'm just going to look at some laps right in here. I'm not going to look at the fastest laps. I'm just going to look at everybody's chunk of laps from the final stint and look at the telemetry and see what it looks like. And I've actually done a cool thing where I average a bunch of laps together rather than just looking at one lap, because just looking at one lap in the race rarely tells us much useful information. So here's the average laps for those 4 drivers from that stint. So lap 34 to lap 39 inclusive. Here's the lap time delta at the end, which is what I'm mostly interested in. We'll dig into a little bit more in a second. You can see that basically at the end of the lap, Verstappen is 6-7 tenths faster than Leclerc and Perez, and about a second faster than Hamilton on these average laps at the end, just like the normal race laps, not the pushing laps. Go further back, we can see that most of the lap time that Max and the other drivers find over Lewis is about in sector 2. So basically from here to here, which is pretty normal. So one thing I didn't notice, and this is what kicked this whole thing off, Lewis is half a second up on both of the Red Bulls by turn 5. And then I looked at this. This is Eau Rouge here. This is the car speed profile through Eau Rouge. You can see both Perez and Max are massively lifting out of the throttle and realistically losing. Here's 2 tenths ahead to 5 tenths behind. Somewhere about 6 or 7 tenths by turn 5 they're giving up. And I'm kind of confused by that. I mean, why are they lifting through Eau Rouge? They've got so much downforce. So I decided to look at something else just as a sanity check, because I'm pretty sure Eau Rouge is almost always flat in F1. So here is Max Verstappen's intermediate lap from qualifying on Friday and his soft lap from qualifying at the end of that session. You can see in both of these places, despite being on wet track conditions, something like 12 seconds a lap slower because there's no grip in sector 2, they're still flat through Eau Rouge. So I'm getting curious now. Let's talk about it. So I went back through the race and took a look at laps during the first stint and the second stint. And here's what I found. During the first stint, we can see that Perez is lifting here, but Max isn't. And yeah, Perez is about, on average, there's traffic and everything else, so it's difficult to say, but half a second faster than Leclerc and about a second a lap faster than Hamilton. That doesn't surprise me that much. Then let's go have a look here at the middle stint. We can see that Max starts lifting off in sector 2, and as we found before, it's maybe half a second difference in terms of liftoff, and you notice that the drivers are doing a little bit different approach here, but the same rest of the lap appears. So what's happening? So the things I noticed is Max wasn't doing this in the first stint, Checo was, and then that made me think of some of the radio messages that we heard during the race. But quickly, if you enjoy these data deep dives, be sure to check out my Buy Me a Coffee link. This is where I post detailed qualifying and race analysis reports every weekend. There's a link in the description below if you want to find some more information about it. Okay, so here's the radio messages I was talking about. GP says to Max, and this is around the first pit stop, he says, "Don't forget, Max, use your head, please." Then Max replies, "Are we both doing it or what?" And then there was an exchange between both of them, GP saying, "Yeah, just follow my instructions, thank you." Then Max replies, "No, I want to know if both cars do it." And then GP replies, "Max, follow my instructions and trust it, thank you." And that was the end of that. So what I'm thinking there, Max, asking, are both cars doing it, seems to tie up pretty clearly what we saw during those stints between the first and second stint. And then I noticed, looking back through the radio transcripts, thanks to multi-viewer for F1, by the way, GP keeps using the words "use your head" throughout the race, and I don't usually see them say stuff like that. Then I went and looked through all of Perez's radio transcripts, and I noticed that they were talking about management and specifically mentioning turns 2 and 3, which is Eau Rouge. So why would Red Bull be deliberately bleeding over half a second through Eau Rouge every lap? Number 1, Red Bull are sandbagging. And honestly, I think this is probably the stupidest suggestion I've come up with, so I'm sorry that I had to start with that. I don't think that's the case, but we can do better than that. Number 2, where there's some car issues with the Red Bull this weekend. That, I don't think that's the case either. In the wet, on 15, 12 second a lap slower, on intermediates, they were flat through Eau Rouge. So did something creep in Saturday and Sunday that meant that they had to lift off and back up through this corner because of some car balance or setup issue? I don't think so, and I think the radio message kind of points us in a different direction from there as well. The third thing that comes to mind is tire management, and this is something that the race engineers and drivers were talking about a lot throughout the race. They did spend a lot of the time on a soft tire, trying to manage this to get a longer stint out of it. But if you look at an entire lap around Spa, if we go back to this first stint, for example, if you wanted to save tire energy, yes, you could save tire energy through Eau Rouge, but saving tires through a high-speed corner that's almost easy flat in order to bleed lap time down the long straight after that makes absolutely no sense. If you really wanted to save tire energy, I would do it somewhere like turn 10. It's a high-speed corner, it's a relatively long duration corner, and there's a very short straight after it. And here you can see Lewis is probably 10 kilometers an hour slower, and he only gives up maybe a tenth here. I mean, that seems like a lot more efficient way to save tires. And then it hit me. There's absolutely no way you're giving up that much lap time unless there's another issue. And that brings me to the fourth option, which is ride heights and car setup. And honestly, it makes so much sense how this weekend you could end up in this situation. So let's talk about ride heights and the limitations on those. So how are ride heights a problem? Earlier, they could go through Eau Rouge flat in the weekend, and now they're lifting off. Well, maybe they were concerned about skid wear. Legality skids are how the FIA police ride height. These skids are placed at 4 positions around the floor. There's one at the leading edge of the floor, one at the back, and then one on each side. The legality holes in each of these skids cannot be found to be worn more than 1 millimeter. And honestly, in the last, 10 years I worked in Formula 1 and years after that watching the sport, I don't think I've ever seen a team thrown out on skid wear. But that's beside the point, and this one's a bit odd. Typically, the front skid is limited by DRS usage at the start of the race when the fuel is high. When the DRS is open, you take a lot of load off the rear and the front gets lowered to the ground, and you'll typically ground the front more. The rear skids are limited by high speed with DRS off, and this goes the same for the sides, as there's a lot of load on the car with the DRS closed, maybe going through a corner, and you're compressing the car and pushing these skids into the ground. But for a circuit like Spa, it's not the end of straight, which is the limitation for ride height. It's the massive compression the car goes through Eau Rouge. Now, the difference between being legal and illegal on your skid wear could be the difference between 1 or 2 millimeters of ride height. It's insanely fine. And putting that in context, 2 millimeters of front ride height isn't a huge deal. It will gain you a little bit of front load. If the teams were chasing this, I really doubt this weekend they ran out of front wing balancing power, so I don't think it's that. Rear ride height, 2 millimeters of rear ride height is not really a big deal. It's a small shift. This is like a tiny adjustment. This isn't a huge performance differentiator at all. So here are 2 reasons I could think they might have found themselves in this position. The first thing that came to mind when I was thinking of explanations for this is maybe Red Bull wanted to set up the ride height a little bit lower to optimize the car for an intermediate or wet setup. The weekend looked like it was going to be wet. So another thing a lot of people don't know is that the intermediates and wet tires are actually larger in diameter. So when you fit these tires, the car has an effective higher ride height. So maybe they thought about offsetting this ride height, but still, that's only a small change like we talked about before. And honestly, I don't think you'd ever optimize a setup for full wet, especially if you're not 100% certain that the entire weekend is going to be a washout. So again, that idea doesn't really make any sense at all. Here's the second thing, and I think this is actually an easier explanation. It was a sprint race weekend, which means you only get free practice 1 to set up the car. And guess what? Free practice 1 was wet. So it's possible that after setting up the car for the wet, they realize, you know what, maybe we might be wearing the skid out too much. Teams have load sensors in the T-trays or the front of the car, which give you an indication of how much you're pushing on the car. So teams have a good idea of what's happening with this front skid. The rear skids and side skids, I don't I don't think they have much measurement there. So maybe they saw something and said, you know what, we need to be careful about this in the race. So rather than risking too much plank wear, they said, you know what, we'll back out of it. We'll lose a little bit of lap time. We'll still win the race, and we'll make sure that we have no issues with legality on plank wear. I know I said I would come back to Max and Lewis's fastest lap attempt so we could see actually how much they were pushing and how much was left in hand. So as promised, here's the telemetry between Max and Lewis's 2 laps. And honestly, Lewis's lap on the medium was pretty insane, but looking at it, the Red Bull wasn't really pushing. So let's talk through it quickly. Here's the car speed, here's the throttle, and here's the lap time difference. You can see at the end of the lap, Lewis is over 1.5 seconds faster than Max's fastest lap. But again, Max lifting out through Eau Rouge, and he's down nearly a second by turn 5. And another thing to notice is when Max went for this push attempt, or apparent push attempt, he wasn't even using energy. You can see how they clip here at the end of the straight. So I don't think that was a fast lap attempt. And I think Red Bull were more worried about their setup or something else going on with the car. But that was a pretty fast lap from Lewis. So we still don't know how far ahead could Red Bull have won this race from Leclerc, for example, without managing whatever this issue or whatever this thing was. First, I think it's best to clarify that all this is speculation, but it's the best explanation I can come up with a little bit of context. If anything, this is actually a fun exercise as a reminder that race engineers actually spend more of their time making the car go as least slow as possible rather than as fast or as most fast as possible during a weekend. That's honestly the sad truth of engineering a race car. And it's a super frustrating game, especially for sprint weekends where you only get one practice session to set the car up. And if you miss something, well, you've got to be able to give up performance in order to complete the race. So if I had to guess how much the liftoff was costing Red Bull by the end of the race, I'd say that the Red Bulls had at least 20 seconds in hand each. So that means Verstappen could have finished about 50 seconds ahead of Leclerc. Now, don't forget to check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description below. And I'll have another video for you guys soon about McLaren's performance and going from back of the grid to podium challenger. And I think this is a really interesting analysis. So be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys soon.